coming. Hopefully it'll be an interesting evening as we discuss the existence of God. Before we really get into the hard questions of whether a Christian God exists, perhaps we should ask ourselves, which God? Which God are we talking about? Because the Bible contains a number of gods. What are the properties does this God have? Are we talking about the same God when we talk about the Christian God? Is all of our concepts of the Christian God the same? Is he a physical God, or is he an ethereal God? Is he loving or sadistic? Does he decide morality based on fiat? In other words, deciding for himself what is moral and what is not? Or is he simply communicating to the people what is intrinsically moral? As if, communicating the number pi. You don't have a choice about that. God doesn't either. Is he omnipresent? Or does he exist in some kind of physical location? And is he omnipotent? Does he have all power to make anything happen anywhere in the universe instantly? These are questions we have to ask about God, because to say you believe in the Christian God doesn't matter if you don't know what that belief consists of and what that God actually represents. So let's first talk about the God of the Torah. The God of the Torah is an evil character. He likes the smell of burning flesh. We learn about this God through Moses. And we've already referred to the commands given to us supposedly by Moses. Moses being an Egyptian, previously an Egyptian prince. And interestingly enough, Egyptian princes of that time, of that period, would have been very familiar with the Egyptian moral standards, which are pretty much exactly the same as written down in the Ten Commandments. In fact, they're much more extensive, as is documented in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. They were plagiarized. Is God of the Torah a good God? Well, if I were to take my son up to a mountaintop and threaten to sacrifice him because of some God, I would say that God is evil. Demanding that someone sacrifice their son, regardless of the reasons, is an immoral and evil act. The God of the Torah is self-admittedly vengeful and concerned with only worship for himself. The very first commandment is, "Thou shalt only worship him." This is the first of the gods. The second God is the God of the Gospels, or the God as taught by Jesus. And I'm not talking about the subsequent God that was taught by Paul. I'm talking about the God that was proclaimed by Jesus. Jesus talked about praising God. He was a monotheistic believer. He believed in God, but he didn't believe in himself as being God. He didn't talk of himself in that way to anyone, and that is not in the Gospels. Now, you don't have to believe a rationalist in this regard. If you talk to most Islamists, they will use the same point, that in the Gospels, Jesus is not making the claim for himself that he is the deity of God. What God is in the Gospels is a good God, a loving God, a God which is going to look after you, and a bit of a father figure. He's not a particularly powerful God. He's pretty much been reduced from parting seas to doing magic shows around Jesus. Perhaps healing the occasional person, maybe making a few loaves of bread. These are the kinds of tricks we can conjure in today's magic shows. But I think the worst part of this particular God is the fact that he is so condescending to us. He is a father figure, and we are forever children. We are never allowed to grow up. We are never given self-responsibility. We are always being told to worship, to honour Him, to obey Him, to defer to Him. It's always about believing and bowing down to this God, even though He is meant to be so loving. It discourages reason to do this. It discourages your own self-responsibility. And it promotes the idea that there is virtue in faith in the unseen. But this is not the God you believe. This is not the Christian God, is it not? Is this the God you believe perhaps is more related to this third God? The God of St. Paul. We are, of course, talking about Jesus. Because there was a change from Jesus and what Jesus taught, which was proclaiming God, to what St. Paul taught, which was proclaiming Jesus as a deity, as Zach has already suggested. There is a problem with this particular picture. The problem is that the first commandment of the Torah is to worship only God. And if you're only worshipping God, you're obviously not going to worship this other guy called Jesus. They can't both be God, can they? And I think this is the essential reason we got confused, and basically all these different concepts of God, the Abrahamic God, the God of Jesus, and finally Jesus himself as God, comes together in what we could look at as the fourth God, the God of the Trinity. And the God of the Trinity is incongruous. It's a God which has a whole lot of characteristics which are completely in opposition to one another. How can you have a loving God and a vengeful God? How can you have these things in the same entity? It just doesn't work. Basically, this mixture of God is a Franken God. It's not real. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist because it's logically impossible. You can't have characteristics of the same entity being completely contradictory to one another. Oops. So what are we really talking about when we're coming here today and talking about belief in the Christian God? Are we talking about any of these gods, any of these four gods? I don't think so. We're talking about the personal God that you believe in. And I want to discuss now why you believe in that God. Do you believe it because you have read extensively the Bible and the history and all of the theological arguments, or is it something else? Where did your God belief come from? Why were you first convinced that a God exists and what the nature of that God was? Is it based on the Church's doctrine of the virtue of faith, that by faith alone you can know the truth? I can tell you where you first probably learned about it. This isn't true of everyone. There are people who come to God and God belief later in life. But the vast majority of people learn about God when they're children. Children are vulnerable to being taught different beliefs. This is why you can get children to believe in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy. What is the difference between these entities and God? Well, the difference is that eventually your parents tell you that the other ones don't exist. But we're all convinced, or the people around you, your parents and your siblings, your friends, or the friends at church, possibly the friends at school. If you live in a society which is homogeneous and they all believe a particular thing, the chances are you tend to be believing that throughout your life. And it's true whether you're in an Islamic society or a Hindu society or a Buddhist society, or a Christian society. When you're 5 years old, you are very, very impressionable. And this is why we have religious indoctrination in schools in various forms, so that you can get to the children in time to be able to instill these kinds of belief. And I think if you ask yourself honestly why you believe what you do, why you believe that faith is enough, it is because you've been indoctrinated that way since you were a child. The way they do it is not through lights in the eyes and strapping you into chairs or anything terrible. It's through things like telling you stories, Bible stories, ones that have been filtered of all the nasty stuff. Singing nice prayers about how nice God is and how wonderful He is, and how He's going to protect you like a loving Father. These things are very psychologically pleasing, and this is the reason why they work. They're a very powerful psychological tool for creating belief in young humans. And as you grow older, you exist in a society which predominantly believes in God, so your beliefs are reinforced. You're hardwired to believe your parents and trust in them. So when your parents tell you, and when people around you tell you and reinforce this belief in God, you are very, very unlikely to question it. And before I move on to the next slide, I think it's also a problem that a failure of faith, if you say that you are doubting in God, to people who believe in God, that is seen as a sin, as a failure. To not have faith is the worst sin in many respects, because when you start to doubt, when you start to let the doubt in, then potentially the faith will crumble. How emotionally invested are you in your God? It is true that a sense of God, a sense of divine overseeing, can give people support and consolation. It can make you feel that there is someone on your side when there is no one. It can give you consolation when people have died who are close to you, and you want to find some kind of reason or some kind of consolation in that. There can also be negative emotions. An installation of fear in the afterlife, that there is something that's going to terrible happen to you if you do not believe as you've been told. And it provides a sense of a feeling of purpose. And it may be a false sense of purpose. So these are things which may cause you to believe in God, which have nothing to do with the rational evidence. This is purely about your emotional state and your investment in the God belief itself. The dark side of religion is those who are trying to leave or who doubt. I've talked to many people, and in fact have had family members and friends deal with this problem. Either having to deal with the issue themselves, or with other people they know being rejected. When you give up your faith, potentially you can lose your friends. And if you're a churchgoer, all your friends in your community are around you. And to give up that faith means leaving all your friends behind. Again, it's an emotional tie. Potentially, if you come out as an unbeliever, your siblings may reject you. Your parents may disown you, as is happening often in Utah, where children are actually put onto the street if they come out as atheists. And perhaps even worse is if you come out as an atheist or an unbeliever, you lose your partner and your children. So these are some of the things which keep people in belief when there is no real evidence for it. And my case today is not to tell you what you should believe or what you shouldn't believe, but to ask you if you are willing to examine your belief in God honestly. I want you to ask why you started to believe in your God. I want you to examine why you started to believe in God, and if that is a justifiable reason. I want you to look at the emotional ties that your religion has over you, and to try and understand those emotional ties so they no longer control you. And more than anything else, I want you to read. I want you to read your Bibles. And I want you to read other books which are critical of the Bible, so that you have more, so you are armed with more knowledge rather than just simply belief. Thank you.